On October 14, 1944, two German generals arrived at Erwin Rommel's home in Herrlingen with an offer and a threat. Rommel is remembered as the Desert Fox, one of the most skilled commanders of the Second World War, a man who earned respect even from his enemies. But the story of what became of his family in the years that followed that afternoon is one that almost never gets told, and it should be. To understand what his family faced, you first have to understand who Erwin Rommel actually was. Not the legend, but the man, and the position he occupied in Nazi Germany by the autumn of 1944. Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, in what is now southwestern Germany. He was not from the traditional Prussian military aristocracy that dominated the German officer class. His father was a schoolteacher, and he rose through the ranks on the basis of his own talent rather than family connections. He served in the First World War with distinction, earning the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military honor, for his actions during the Italian campaign in 1917. By the time the Second World War began, he had attracted the attention of the Nazi leadership as a man of unusual ability. His fame came with the Afrika Korps. Between 1941 and 1943, Rommel commanded German and Italian forces in North Africa in a campaign that made him one of the most widely recognized military figures of the war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill acknowledged Rommel's skill in a speech to the House of Commons in January 1942, describing him as a great general. Coming from the leader of the nation Rommel was fighting against, it was a remarkable thing to say. But by 1944, the war had turned. The Allies had landed in France. Germany was losing on multiple fronts, and Rommel, commanding Army Group B in northwestern France, had become involved, in ways that are still debated by historians, with the officers planning to remove Adolf Hitler from power. The July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt on Hitler failed. The bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia wounded Hitler but did not kill him. In the crackdown that followed, thousands were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Among those whose names surfaced was Erwin Rommel. Rommel was at home, recovering from wounds sustained on July 17, 1944, when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. He had suffered a fractured skull and other serious injuries. He was in no condition to be publicly tried. Hitler, aware that Rommel's public standing was enormous, both within Germany and internationally, did not want the spectacle of putting the Desert Fox on trial. Instead, on October 14, 1944, Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel drove to Herrlingen with a choice. Rommel could take poison and be given a state funeral with full honors, or he could face a people's court where a public execution and the likely arrest of his family would follow. Rommel chose the poison. He was dead within 15 minutes. The official announcement said he had died of his wounds. He was given a state funeral. Hitler sent a wreath. His wife Lucie knew the truth. His son Manfred knew the truth. And they were required under threat to say nothing for as long as the regime remained in power. What that silence cost them, and what they did with what came after, is where this story really begins. Manfred Rommel was born on December 24, 1928. He was 15 years old when his father died. He was the only child of Erwin and Lucie Rommel, and the weight of what happened on October 14, 1944, landed on him in a way that would shape the rest of his life. He had spent the last years of the war as a flak auxiliary, a young man assigned to anti-aircraft units as the German military began drafting teenagers to fill the gaps left by years of attrition. He was not yet 16 when his father was forced to take his own life. The adults around him, his mother, the household, the officers who visited, operated under a blanket of enforced silence about what had actually happened. The official story was injury. The funeral was enormous. Hitler attended in spirit, if not in person. Rommel was buried at Herrlingen on October 18, 1944, with full military honors, and the German public mourned one of their most celebrated commanders. Manfred was a pallbearer at his own father's funeral, knowing, or at least strongly suspecting, that the man in the coffin had not died of his wounds. The precise moment at which Manfred was told the truth is not entirely clear from the historical record. His father had spoken to him briefly before the generals arrived on October 14th, telling him that he had been given the choice and had made it. He told Manfred that within 15 minutes he would be dead, and that the family would be taken care of. He told his son that he was innocent of the charges against him. Those were among the last words Erwin Rommel said to his only child. Manfred processed all of this in silence, in a country still controlled by the regime responsible for his father's death, surrounded by a war that was still producing casualties at an enormous rate. In the final months of the war, he served as a Wehrmacht soldier. He was captured by French forces in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. He was 16 years old. He spent a brief period as a prisoner of war before being released. He returned to a Germany that had been utterly destroyed, physically, politically, morally. The Nazi government was gone, the Allied occupation had begun, and the question of who Erwin Rommel had been, what he had stood for, and what his name now meant in the new Germany was one his son would be navigating for the rest of his life. The weeks and months immediately after the war's end were not easy for anyone connected to the German military, and what they looked like for the Rommel family in particular tells you something important about what survival actually required in those years. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Manfred Rommel was 16 years old, recently released from French captivity, and living in a country under Allied occupation. His mother Lucie was managing whatever remained of the household in Herrlingen. They had each other, the house, and very little else of certainty. The post-war period in Germany was defined by hardship that is difficult to fully convey in retrospect. Cities across the country had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing and by the ground battles of the final months of the war. Food was scarce, infrastructure was broken. Millions of people were displaced, and the basic structures of daily life, work, housing, food supply, legal order, had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was particularly severe, and ordinary Germans, regardless of their personal histories or political affiliations, faced genuine questions of physical survival. The Rommel family was not exempt from this hardship. Whatever financial security Erwin had left behind was complicated by the collapse of the German currency and the general disruption of all normal economic activity. Lucie managed as best she could, and Manfred, a teenager who had spent the last years of his life in uniform, had to figure out what came next. The Allied denazification process also had to be navigated. For the family of Erwin Rommel, this process carried a particular complexity. Rommel had been regarded, both during and after the war, as a professional soldier who had not participated in war crimes and who had, in the end, been killed by the same regime he served. That narrative was complicated by later historical research, but in the immediate post-war years, it meant that the Rommel name was not, in the way of some other prominent names from that era, immediately toxic. Manfred pursued an education. He studied law, eventually obtaining his legal qualifications in the early 1950s. No small achievement in a country rebuilding its institutions from scratch. The seriousness and discipline that those who knew him consistently attributed to him were evident in those years of study. And then he entered public life, in a direction that surprised some people and made complete sense to others. In 1953, Manfred Rommel joined the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, the center-right political party that had become the dominant force in West German politics under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. He entered local government, working his way through the structures of Baden-Württemberg politics with the methodical persistence that would come to define his public career. The path was not without friction. Being the son of Erwin Rommel in post-war West Germany meant being a figure around whom multiple, sometimes conflicting narratives swirled. His father was, depending on who was speaking, a professional soldier who had served Germany honorably, a man who had attempted to resist Hitler, or simply another general who had prosecuted a destructive war on behalf of a criminal regime. Manfred navigated all of these interpretations publicly and, by most accounts, did so with considerable composure. He was elected Lord Mayor of Stuttgart in 1974. He was 45 years old. He held the position for 18 years, serving until 1996, and his tenure in that role became, over time, the primary thing he was known for in Germany, separate from, though never entirely disconnected from, his father's name. Stuttgart is the capital of Baden-Württemberg, a major industrial and commercial city. and the seat of companies like Daimler-Benz and Porsche. Managing a city of that scale and importance required real administrative ability, and Manfred demonstrated it across nearly 2 decades in office. He was re-elected multiple times, which in a functioning democracy means that the people who lived and worked in the city consistently found him competent and trustworthy. He was known as a direct and plain-spoken man. He was also known, within the city, as someone who took specific and deliberate positions on issues that connected to the history he had grown up inside. In 1978, he arranged for the dignified burial in Stuttgart's Waldfriedhof Cemetery of 1,171 former concentration camp inmates whose remains had been discovered in the area. It was not a politically obvious move in the Germany of that moment. It required a willingness to confront a past that many Germans of his generation preferred to leave unexamined, and he made it without apparent hesitation. He also developed, over the course of his years in office, a reputation for a dry and sometimes sharp humor. He was not a solemn public figure in the manner of many politicians from his background and generation. People who worked alongside him described someone who was serious about his responsibilities, but not about his own dignity. A quality that is rarer in public life than it should be. Throughout his time as Lord Mayor, Manfred also engaged actively with the question of his father's legacy, involved in efforts to ensure that Erwin Rommel's history was accurately recorded, engaging with both the admiration and the criticism that attached to the name. He was not defensive about the complexity, but he was clear about what he believed the evidence showed. He died on November 7, 2013, at the age of 84, in Stuttgart. He was buried with his father and mother in the military cemetery in Herrlingen, the family together again, in the town where October 14, 1944, had changed everything. But during all those years of public life, there was a parallel question running alongside it. The question of his father's name, what it meant, what it cost, and whether the historical record could ever arrive at a clear verdict. That question became, in the post-war decades, genuinely contentious. From the moment the war ended, the question of how to understand Erwin Rommel divided opinion in ways that have never been fully resolved. On one side stood the admiration. It was real and it was widespread. Churchill's wartime acknowledgement of Rommel's skill was only the most famous instance of a broader respect that extended across the Allied military. British and American officers who had fought against him in North Africa consistently described him as a formidable and honorable opponent. His tactical innovations, his willingness to share the conditions of his troops in the field, his reported refusal to carry out certain orders, including an order to execute Jewish prisoners and captured commandos in North Africa, all contributed to the post-war image of a soldier who had served within a criminal system without becoming part of its crimes. Barracks and streets in Germany were named after him. A tank destroyer used by the West German military was named after him. The Bundeswehr, the post-war German military established in 1955, treated Rommel as a figure who represented a tradition of military professionalism worth inheriting, precisely because his July 20th connection could be read as evidence that he had ultimately chosen resistance over complicity. On the other side stood the criticism, which grew louder as historical research deepened. Historians examining the record more closely noted that Rommel had been an enthusiastic supporter of Adolf Hitler in the early years of the war. He had commanded the Führerbegleitkommando, Hitler's personal escort, and had written admiringly about the Führer. His prosecution of the North African campaign had served the strategic interests of the Nazi state, and the extent and nature of his involvement in the July 20th plot was and remains genuinely contested. Some historians argue that he had serious reservations about the assassination itself and had not committed fully to the conspiracy before his wounding in July 1944 took him out of action. Manfred engaged with this complexity directly. He maintained consistently that his father had been a professional soldier whose personal conduct had been honorable, and that the circumstances of his death, forced upon him by the regime, made him, in a meaningful sense, a victim of the same system he had served. He was not unaware of the criticisms. He addressed them in interviews and in the biographical material he contributed to over the years. The debate has not ended. German cities that had named streets after Rommel found themselves, in the 2000s, facing renewed pressure to rename them in light of more critical assessments of his record. Some did not. What Manfred's engagement with that debate demonstrated was that he had thought carefully about his father's history and was willing to discuss it seriously, rather than either defending it reflexively or abandoning it entirely. That is a harder thing to do than it sounds, particularly when the subject is your own father, and the debate has been running for 7 decades. But Manfred was not the only person in that family who had to carry something, and the person who carried the heaviest private share of it rarely got written into the main story at all. In almost every account of Erwin Rommel's life and death, Lucie Rommel appears as a secondary figure, the wife in the background, the mother at home. That framing is incomplete. Lucie Maria Mollin was born on June 6, 1894, in Danzig, the city now known as Gdansk in present-day Poland. She and Erwin had known each other since 1911 and had married in November 1916 during the First World War. Their marriage lasted 28 years until his death in October 1944. She was with him through the entire arc of his career, the obscure early years, the rise to fame in North Africa, the increasing pressure of the later war years, and finally the October afternoon when the generals came to the house and her husband said goodbye. She was present in the house at Herrlingen on October 14, 1944. She knew when he walked out of the door with the 2 generals what was going to happen. She waited, and then the telephone call came. What she experienced in the months and years that followed is imperfectly documented. She maintained the required silence about the true circumstances of her husband's death for as long as the regime existed, which was only a few more months since Germany surrendered in May 1945. After the war, she was no longer bound by that silence, and she did speak, including to the British intelligence officer and military historian Basil Liddell Hart, who was among the first serious researchers to engage with Rommel's legacy in the post-war years. Lucie Rommel died on September 26, 1971, in Stuttgart. She was 77 years old. She outlived her husband by 27 years, spending those years largely away from public attention. A private woman who had lived through extraordinary events and who let her son carry the family's public presence forward. She was buried in Herrlingen, beside the grave prepared for Erwin in 1944. When Manfred died in 2013, he was buried there as well. The 3 of them, Erwin, Lucie, Manfred, rest together in the town where the family's defining crisis took place. What Lucie's inner life looked like across those 27 years is something the historical record cannot fully recover. She had known Erwin since she was 17. She had been married to him for 28 years. She had watched him become famous and then watched the regime that used his fame destroy him. And she raised a son who went on to live a remarkable life in his own right. Her son carried the public weight. She carried the private one. What Manfred chose to say publicly about his father, and what he chose to hold back, is a story that only fully makes sense once you understand what he had been sitting with since the age of 15. Over the course of his long life, Manfred Rommel gave many interviews and contributed to many accounts of his father's history. He was not a man who avoided the subject, but he was careful about it, careful in a way that reflected both his legal training and the particular difficulty of speaking publicly about a parent. He was consistent on certain points. He maintained that his father had been innocent of the charges brought against him in connection with the July 20th plot, not in the sense that Rommel had been uninvolved in discussions about removing Hitler, but in the sense that the formal accusation of conspiracy was not fully supported by the evidence that existed. He maintained that the forced death had been an act of political killing by the Nazi regime. However, the German state had chosen to describe it publicly at the time. He also spoke, in interviews across the decades, about what it had been like to be 15 years old and standing at his father's funeral, knowing things that he could not say. He described the strange experience of watching his country mourn a man whose death it had caused, and of carrying that knowledge alone, or nearly alone, since his mother shared it, for months, until the war's end made it possible to speak more freely. He recalled, in one account, the specific words his father had used in those last minutes together before walking out to the waiting car. His father had been calm. That calmness, under circumstances of enormous pressure, was something Manfred returned to repeatedly in his public statements as the quality he associated most directly with his father's character. What Manfred did not do, across all of those years of public engagement with his father's legacy, was attempt to make the story simpler than it was. He did not claim that his father had been a hero of the resistance in the way that some post-war accounts tried to frame the July 20th plotters. He did not claim that his father had been unaware of or uninvolved with the realities of the regime he served. He situated Erwin Rommel within the actual complexity of the historical moment, which required acknowledging things that were uncomfortable alongside the things that reflected well. That consistency, across nearly 7 decades of public life, is one of the things that distinguishes Manfred Rommel's relationship with his father's legacy from the way many families of prominent figures from that era handled the same problem. And the contrast becomes even clearer when you look at what those other families actually did. Manfred Rommel's story is unusual, but it is not entirely unique. The post-war period produced many families who had to navigate the legacy of fathers and husbands who had served in prominent roles in the German military or government during the Nazi era. Some of those families chose silence, closing down any discussion of what their fathers or grandfathers had done, constructing a family narrative in which the wartime years were simply not discussed. This was common enough in the first post-war generation that German historians and psychologists gave it a name: the silence of those who had survived and chosen to say nothing, passing unprocessed grief and guilt to the next generation. Others chose active confrontation, children and grandchildren who spent their own lives investigating and publicly exposing what their relatives had done, often at significant personal and professional cost. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of occupied Poland who was executed at Nuremberg, wrote a book in 1987 that was a devastating indictment of his father and that made Frank a deeply controversial figure in Germany. Bettina Göring, the great-niece of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, has spoken publicly about the burden of the family name and the decision she made to ensure she would not pass it on. These were people who chose direct confrontation and paid for that choice in public controversy and personal cost. Manfred's path was different from both silence and denunciation. He engaged consistently and seriously with the historical record. He acknowledged complexity while maintaining a specific reading of the evidence about his own father. Whether that reading was entirely accurate is something historians continue to debate, but the manner in which he held it, the willingness to engage with critics, to discuss the uncomfortable aspects of his father's record, to admit openly what remained uncertain, gave his engagement a quality that even those who disagreed with his conclusions could respect. There were other children of Wehrmacht officers who followed similar paths into public life, into the Bundeswehr, into law, into politics, constructing lives inevitably shaped by their origins, but not entirely defined by them. The question of what to do with an inherited name that carries both honor and damage is not one that resolves itself. It requires active choices, made repeatedly over the course of a lifetime. Manfred Rommel made those choices in full public view, in a position of significant civic responsibility over nearly 4 decades. And the record of those choices, what he said, what he built, what he stood for, is its own kind of answer to the question of what happened to Erwin Rommel's family after October 14th, 1944. Erwin Rommel's grave in Herrlingen is visited every year by people from across Germany and from other countries. Historians, veterans, military enthusiasts, and people who are simply curious about one of the Second World War's most complex figures. The grave is modest. There is a stone, a name, a date. The village around it is quiet, and nothing about its appearance suggests that anything of particular historical weight happened here. But something did. And the consequences of what happened on October 14, 1944, ran forward through decades, through post-war poverty, through denazification, through a legal career and a political career, and nearly 20 years of civic leadership, through hundreds of interviews and speeches and careful public engagements with a history that never fully released its hold. Manfred Rommel spent 84 years navigating the aftermath of an October afternoon he had been 15 years old to witness. He became a lawyer. He became a politician. He became the elected leader of one of Germany's major cities and held that position for nearly 2 decades. He arranged the burial of concentration camp victims with the dignity they had been denied. He engaged honestly with a complicated history, his father's, and his country's, without retreating into either false pride or performative guilt. He died in Stuttgart in 2013, in the city he had helped rebuild, and was laid to rest in the town where his father's story had ended. Lucie Rommel died in 1971, after 27 years of widowhood, having said what she had to say to the historians who asked and kept the rest to herself. She was buried beside her husband in Herrlingen. Manfred joined them in 2013. The story of what happened to Erwin Rommel's family after his death is, in its most fundamental shape, a story about what it costs to survive proximity to history. Not to make history, Erwin did that, but to live in its aftermath, to carry its weight through the ordinary years that follow extraordinary ones, and to construct something worth having from whatever remains. Manfred Rommel did that. By most available measures, he did it well. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.